I want to start by giving the main idea of this talk right up front. So we developed a spiking neural network that emulates the brain network and the specialized neurons that are responsible for learning the environment where we move. We did that only to make a striking observation as the robot explored the environment. Play cells, which are specialized cells, were generated inside Loihi, as I'm going to explain, in real time, and learned the environment similarly to what recent experiments have reported and what is happening in the brain. So the pattern of emergence for these neurons and the receptive fields were very similar to those reported in the literature. Play cells, just giving you a context, are specialized neurons in the brain, and they're believed to be key cells for navigation. And we did not handcraft these neurons. The neuronal activity emerged as the neurons learned, and as I will describe next. This study is, in fact, part of our ongoing effort to design a holistic neuromorphic solution that tackles the problem of autonomous navigation for our in-house robots, from sensing to planning and to mapping the environment. The main challenge for our methods is to outperform conventional methods at comparable scales. So in this quest, I found it particularly useful to inform the technical contributions with a principled understanding of neuroscience. That's why our overarching goal is to scale neuromorphic solutions by further pursuing their biological plausibility. To achieve this goal, we computationally capture recent breakthroughs in neuroscience. We translate this knowledge into learning algorithms and brain-optimized architectures, and we harness the emerging human-like behavior into Loihi, which allows us to benchmark our robots. And we give measurable evidence that our approach is more robust, versatile, and orders of magnitude more energy efficient compared to deep learning, especially when it's evaluated in real-world settings. So our networks span the entire cycle of a robot's autonomous operation, from sensing and acting, tasks that do not need much cognitive effort, to localization and mapping that require some cognitive effort, and finally to higher cognitive functions such as planning. I emphasize that the more complicated the targeted task, the sparser the neuroscience knowledge becomes. For our robotic head, for example, our spiking network emulated the human oculomotor system and therefore needed no training to control the robotic eyes as they were tracking the target. Now, this goes against the backpropagation school of thought and essentially signifies that an a priori knowledge of network topology can serve or partially serve at least the function. But in planning, neuroscience knowledge breaks into pieces that are hard to glue together through algorithmic extrapolations. So we came up with a more mathematically rigorous approach relying on a spiking reinforcement learning framework. In between, there is this somehow complex task of localization and mapping that this talk is focusing, where we need to learn the environment based on our belief of where we are standing inside. So these solutions sit on top of both basic and translative research that we do here at Combra Lab. Computational models capture the cellular principles of brain intelligence, which drive our design of spiking networks that span a range of brain mimesis, from imitating the brain's connectome to drawing from the brain's computational attributes such as computation through spikes. So these networks are implemented on Loihi, as I said, and are benchmarked as controllers in robotic tasks. But I think it's a far better way to give a low-dimensional representation of this research line. So what we do is we start by developing computational models that capture the functionally relevant cellular mechanisms and map them as computational principles to spiking networks. Now, this emerging behavior in the spiking networks feeds into the neuromorphic hardware and then controls the robots. That's how we evaluate both the validity of the models and their applicability to our robots. So in a sense, like our research paves a brain-inspired path from the microscopic real world to the macroscopic real world, where behavior emerges. Now, this is where all began. Most of you should be familiar with this work by now, as it has received some attention, both from the community and the media, partly because it was one of the first efforts to demonstrate an end-to-end neuromorphic solution that outperformed the state of the art in terms of power efficiency while being similarly accurate. So we developed a spiking network architecture that uses the specialized localization neurons, place cells, head direction cells, and emulated their topology. We solved here the 1D, the rotational problem, and although the problem is simple, there were crucial algorithmic parts that were missing, and we had to develop spike-based solutions for each one. Now, the spiking network preserved the biological interpretability, and this allowed us to relate the activity of its neurons with the environment, something that is an open question in deep learning. So we learned the environment by modifying the STDP rule to forget what is not essential. This is old news. This has been published. I'm just showing that the basic idea is that STDP was sufficient to learn the environment by mapping it to connections of a semi-structured architecture that draws from the brain's network. We benchmark this approach. We compare it against G-mapping, a widely used SLAM method, and we found that it consumed 2 orders of magnitude less power than G-mapping, and this was perhaps one of the first benchmarking for a neuromorphic real-time robotic controller. Now, the issue is that a robot turning around itself does not really have much meaning. That's why we're now extending this work to a 2D environment. And let me describe how we solved for localization in mapping in this 2D environment. To describe the solution, I'll first introduce how grid cells encode position in the brain and how we followed the same encoding principles. Now, grid cells are organized in a series of modules that encode the same distance, but with different steps. So for presentation purposes, I show here how 3 modules can encode this position in this 1D track. Each module has, in this case, 3 grid cells. The receptive fields are represented by different colors. And as we move from module 1 to module 2, the receptive fields of the grid cells increase. Now, using this simple strategy, we can use a small group of grid cells to uniquely represent each position that our robot is placed in along 1D track. 2D. So the start position is encoded as 1, 1, 1, based on the activity of the grid cells for each module. And the goal position is encoded as 1, 1, 2. Now, our goal is to learn this grid cell encoding for each position and store that information in place cells. I'll now describe the network architecture and learning rules that we use to generate the place field for the from that activity of the grid cells. So grid cells are activated or deactivated based on the sense odometry of the mobile robot. And for the 2D case, grid cells in the same module share the same spacing, but they have different phases, so they span the entire 2D space. So the receptive field for a grid cell is essentially a triangular lattice in that 2D space. So we also had the number of neurons that are available to become place cells. Each module that you see connected to 20% of the place cells. So the place cells become randomly active in this environment, much like what neuroscience is telling us that place cells do. To generate the place fields for the place cells, we used competitive local learning and trained the weights between grid cells and place cells. There was also this winner-take-all connection between place cells to allow for a single place cell, the one that had the highest activity to dominate all the others. And that winner place cell was the one that learned the grid cell encoding for that given position. Let me say one word about the insight behind the local learning rule for that place field generation. We want the place cell to learn the grid cell encoding of the given position. So a place cell should only be activated by one grid cell encoding, which encodes the current position, and not by other encodings. To do this, we want the place cell to have a positive weight in connections from grid cells that encode that given position, and negative weights in connections from inactive grid cells. That's why this learning rule has two components. The first part increases the weight for connections with active grid cells, and the second one decreases the weights for connections with inactive grid cells. And both parts were guarded by the spiking of the place cell. So at every position, only the weights of that particular active place cells were changed. For any given position, we constructed a map of the surrounding area. We used a 360-degree leader, which measures the distance to the nearest objects on a fixed height. This is a work actually we presented at IROS 2019, where we showed the spike-based reference transformation from an egocentric camera-based representation to an allocentric representation. That's what you see here as the green map that transforms what the leader sees to a word reference frame. So now we need to get place cells to learn these distributed maps. Each place cell is initially connected to all map neurons with zero weight. And we introduced again associative learning between the map neurons and the active place cell. So this associative learning formed the distributed map for that particular place cell. So map neurons represent the surroundings in a certain location. And the learned weights between the place cell and the map neurons represent the local map of that position. So when the robot was exploring the environment, multiple distributed maps were learned for different place cells. And if you combine all these distributed maps, you get up with a unique 2D representation of the environment, as I will show. Now, we want to encourage associative behavior and discourage non-associative behavior. So the weight increases when both map neuron and the place cell are active, and decrease when only the place cell is active. So the two components of this learning rule filter out the noise from the leader and use only the most significant observations to form the map. This is an example of a 2D mapping and just 3 place cells that emerged on Loihi. So as the mobile robot explores this maze within a single run, a map of the environment is generated, and I'm showing here the learned receptive fields for these 3 place cells. Here you can see the position that the place cell is activated and its learned distributed map. The place cell is only activated when the robot is at that particular position, and the place cell also learns the distributed map surrounding this position. Now, since each place cell has its own distributed map, if you combine all the distributed maps from all place cells, you end up with creating this unified 2D map that you see here. This work actually complements a much larger effort to design a neuromorphic robot that exhibits that multiple human-like behavior at comparable performance levels. We helped, for example, with sensing the environment efficiently. 3 months ago, we presented a neuromorphic controller for a biomimetic robotic head that tracks targets in the environment while exhibiting some I would say, widely desired characteristics in AI, such as interpretability and minimal to no training. For moving the body of our robot, we developed a local planner based on a spiking actor-critic network that helped the robot navigate in an unknown environment. And we compared our method against deep learning that ran on a low-power AI chipset, and our spiking controller ran on Loihi was 75 times more power efficient than the deep network. And we also achieved a higher success rate by 4% than deep networks, even when we used the stochastic input to drive deep learning. And this shows that this inherent stochasticity of the spiking neurons in deeper layers further improves the ability of the robot to do what? To escape from the local media. Now, the problem is that any algorithm is as good as its running environment allows it to be. So we had to also solve many different problems, such as the one of uneven threads. To solve this, we used the computational power of an underappreciated brain cell, astrocytes, that we have long been studying in the lab. And we developed the astrocytic mechanism on Loihi and built a central pattern generator that drove this robotic hexacode. And we used this astrocytes extrasynaptic mechanism that changed the network function without changing its structure. And I want to emphasize this. With astrocytes, we modulated the behavior of the network by only changing the firing pattern of its neurons. So multiple behaviors emerged from a single network by changing how neurons fire in time, not the weights between them. So that is, again, going against the deep learning that changes the network structure for any given function. We validated this CPG in walking, but this is a general spike-based method to generate any repetitive behavior. And this work attracted some media attention last summer, so feel free to read the article and get a better idea. Now, to help learning to walk, we also developed a method that introduces deep reinforcement learning algorithms, both on policy and off policy, to the spiking domain. Given a deep reinforcement learning method, we generated a spiking counterpart that has the same exceptional performance while being orders of magnitude more energy efficient. And we allowed Loihi to interact in real time with the OpenAI gene and benchmarked our methods in 4 environments with the most rich and unstable dynamics that we could find. We evaluated the rewards gained, an indication of how well and how fast we learn, and we got the same level of exceptional performance compared to deep network, and for some of them, we did even better. Now, as for energy consumption, as someone would expect, this is where neuromorphic method outperforms any AI method. It consumes 140 times less energy per inference than the deep network. Well, this talk gave you some hints on how we solve for behavior by compartmentalizing it. We developed individual algorithmic solutions for building a head, a body, and legs. And we're just going to do it one more time. We built a head, a body, and legs. So we're moving towards one system that will exhibit multiple behaviors. But this needs us to fundamentally refine our computing strategy. So far, I've described a distributed neuromorphic computing architecture where each problem is solved by a single spiking neural network. But the brain computes efficiently because different types of sensory signals are processed in different regions. So the immediate step is a cluster architecture that processes multiple signals in parallel. Well, the natural extension then is to develop an associative architecture where the abstracted information is coupled in different networks, having interconnected behaviors. And this is where our work can help. This is where local plasticity that we've been looking at can help to recruit new resources from other networks when needed. And this is exactly what is happening in the brain in a stroke, for example, where intact parts of the brain take over the residual function. This is where synchronization will help. It's another area that we're actively looking at to share neurons efficiently by having the same neurons do different tasks in different time intervals. And this is where keeping the entire network in a near critical regime will help. This is a work I presented almost 2 years ago at NICE to ensure its overall computational efficiency, just like in our brain. That concludes my talk. I hope we will have the chance to see each other soon and have the chance to physically interact with one another. I really look forward